something comes up in the course of the presentation and you decide you would rather it not be on YouTube after this, just email me and let me know, and that's totally fine. I want to do a quick little plug both for the rest of our upcoming workshops. We have 2 more: choosing a business structure, entity formation for farmers with Legal Food Hub, and a workshop with all the amazing folks at UConn Extension, which you can check out in the link I just sent to the chat. And if you want to learn more about the new Connecticut Farmer Alliance or join our listserv, which also basically means joining our membership because there's no membership dues or secret password or anything, you can learn more about us at our website. Again, if you could just introduce yourself in the chat. And without further ado, I will pass it along to our presenters. Hamsa is going to share her screen, and Hamsa, Joan, and Chelsea will all be taking us on a wonderful journey of Advocacy 101. If you have any questions while they're talking, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will make sure that the questions get asked and answered. Thanks.
Thank you, MC. So thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is called Cultivating Food or Farm and Food Policies in Connecticut. Hamsa, can you go to the next slide, please? Before we get started, I'll just have us all introduce ourselves. So my name is Chelsea Gazillo. I am the New England Policy Manager at American Farmland Trust. In Connecticut, I direct the Working Lands Alliance. I was trying to think of one thing that I'm really excited about this week, and I think that one thing would be that I'm hoping to get out and do some cross-country skiing. Hopefully some afternoon this week, I'll have some free time in my calendar to get out with my husky and do some skiing. So I'll hand it over to Hamsa to introduce herself, and we'll get started here shortly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hamsa. Thank you, Chelsea, for giving me the first part of the introduction. I am a Master's of Science candidate at Tufts University in Boston in Agriculture, Food, and Environment, and I'm also a board member with Sustainable CT in Connecticut. I am a Connecticut native, even though I currently don't live there, and I'm very excited this week to have a couple of baking projects keyed up, so I'm hoping to finish a bunch of work and get into the kitchen. And I'll pass it on to Joan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Joan Nichols. I'm the Executive Director, Connecticut Farm Bureau Association. It's great to have you join us today. So 20 minutes ago, I was cross-country skiing, Chelsea, on my—
That's what made me think of it.
Yes, my neighbor gave me permission to ski her 250 acres of permanently protected farmland, which I literally walk across the street and into the hayfield. And so you pulled me off the slope. So I'm looking forward to a little bit more snow and maybe some more of that this week. And I will invite you, Chelsea.
That would be great. I would love that.
Thank you.
All right, Hamsa, can you go to the next slide? So we have a pretty packed workshop for you all today. And like MC said, if you have questions as we go through all of this, please put them in the chat and MC will make sure that we try to answer them as they come in. So the first thing that we're going to cover is what is advocacy? What does it mean to be an advocate? And then we're going to go through an Advocacy 101 training, including how a bill becomes a law in Connecticut, which I think will be really interesting for a lot of you. And then we're going to talk about good food and agricultural policies that are currently moving through the Connecticut State Legislature. And I put these policies into 3 buckets for land, environment, and people. We're not going to cover every single policy that's moving through the state legislature, but just a few exciting ones that I've identified. And then we're going to look at some charts on how our food and farm policies compare to the rest of New England. Then we will discuss advocating at the federal level, and we will close by reviewing how you can become more involved with some of the organizations that we're connected to that are doing direct and grassroots advocacy. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does it mean to do advocacy? What exactly is advocacy? As you can see from this slide, these turkeys are advocating to this gentleman for a non-traditional Thanksgiving. What do you all think that that means? Anyone want to answer? All right, that's okay. Next slide, please. I thought that it might be good for us to start by defining advocacy. So advocacy defined is a verb to support or argue for a cause, policy, to plead in favor of. They advocate in return of traditional teaching methods, or in the case of the last slide that we saw, they advocated for a non-traditional Thanksgiving. A group that advocates for veganism. So it can also be, so it's a transitive verb, I'm sorry, I can't talk today, or an intransitive verb, which means to act as an advocate for something or someone. So a tradition of advocating for the equality and civil rights of people. Next slide, please. So advocate defined, which is a little bit different than advocacy. An advocate is a noun, so it's one who pleads the cause of another. So going back to that first slide that we saw with the turkeys would be the advocate. So specifically, one who pleases the cause of another before tribunal or judicial court. One who defends or maintains a cause or proposal. An advocate of liberal arts education. One who supports or promotes the interests of a cause or group. A consumer advocate, or an advocate for women's health, or in our case, an advocate for agriculture or farmland. Next slide, please. So here's a fast fact for everyone. If you are associated with a nonprofit in the state, less than 3% of nonprofits lobby to advance their mission, compared to the 100% that have the legal right to do so. It can be hard to fundraise, as Joan probably knows, to be able to pay for grassroots or nonprofit organizations to do lobbying, since so many grants are tied to programs and projects, and less so advocacy, because advocacy can be very variable, and it's hard to get funders to support it when it is so variable, and there's no guarantee that you're going to have the outcomes that you seek to have. Joan, do you want to add anything to that?
Nope, you're doing good.
Okay, great. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because this is the Advocacy 101 part. So there are a lot of components of successful advocacy, and I'm going to start with the building relationships with policymakers, since it's at the top of the screen. So this is somewhere where farmers can start to think about events, or if you have like a CSA day pickup, or you know, anything that you're already doing on your farm, if there is a chance for you to invite your local legislators or even local elected officials. So if you live in a city where you have city councilors, or if you live in a municipality where you have a planning board, this is an opportunity for you to invite your elected officials and build relationships with policymakers. And the reason why I'm starting with this one is because it's important to have relationships with your policymakers before you go to them with an ask, right? So it's a lot easier to ask somebody that you already know to do something for you than somebody that you don't have a relationship with. Joan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think I'll cover that in later slides, Chelsea, a little bit more detail.
All right, so now I'm going to go to the left. So educating the public on policy issues. So if we want to see some of the, if you have a policy in mind that you want to see pass, it's important that you not only get the buy-in of your local legislators and state officials, or local officials and state legislators, but also you want to make sure that the public supports the policy issue that you're trying to move forward to. And so this might involve going to various organizations, or speaking to your neighbors, or if you're part of a congregation or a church, talking to members of your congregation or church about the issue at hand and why it is so important that your community supports and or the state supports what you're trying to do. Because legislators they're not just going to listen to one person, they're going to listen to the community, and they want to make sure that the public buys into whatever they're trying to pass. And so as a nonprofit, we really have to be careful with partisan engagement. And so a lot of nonprofits have to stick to nonpartisan voter engagement. This means that we are trying to move forward with issues that are not going to be divisive or controversial, or we want to make sure that as a nonprofit that we're not like endorsing a Democrat or a Republican. We can't do that. So we have to make sure that everything we do is nonpartisan. So that's why that is there. This slide, I think it's really good, and it is super relevant to this, but this was also designed for a nonprofit advocacy, just to let you all know. So then, in addition to building relationships with policymakers, we also have to educate policymakers on the issue. So when you invite a farmer or a policymaker to your farm, and let's say it's a CSA day pickup, and you have the policymaker out there and you're talking to them about some of the challenges that you're experiencing as a farmer, if you can have a policy in mind that might help rectify some of the issues you're speaking of, that's great. Or at least discussing like what you might need from the state or from your local officials to rectify whatever the issue is. So having those things lined up is extremely helpful. And then leaning on us as service providers to do research to support whatever policy you're trying to move forward. As farmers, you probably don't have the capacity to do the same amount of research that folks like Hamsa and Joan and I can do, but we can really help support you in providing statistics and facts that will support hopefully whatever you're trying to move forward, or whatever policies you want to see passed. Or in some cases, you may want to kill a policy, and sometimes statistics and research can help kill a policy as much as it can help pass a policy. And we'll talk more about that when we go through how a bill becomes a law. And then there might be cases when you want to reach out to the media. There's a farmer in Shelton, Connecticut, who you probably many of you on this call may have heard of, or you may know him, Terry Jones. He writes frequent op-eds in the CT Post about why farming is so important, and oftentimes he will add call outs for specific programs and policies that he would like policymakers and decision makers to support. And this kind of goes hand in hand with educating the public on policy issues. And so, writing those op-eds can be a critical piece of advocacy. You may also want to reach out to newspapers or to local radio stations and or TV stations to come to your farm at some point. If you are inviting a policymaker there to talk about a specific issue, that can be a way to get publicity around the issue. And that might also incentivize the policymaker to come to your farm because they know that they will be getting the publicity as well. Joan, would you like to add anything to that? Oh, she's saying I'm doing a good job, so that's good. So then coalition building. if you are working on a policy where you know, there are a lot of stakeholders that are going to be impacted by the policy. So for instance, let's use the Working Lands Alliance as an example. When the Working Lands Alliance was formed in 1999, it was very obvious that there needed to be a robust coalition around farmland protection that needed to include municipal officials, service providers, agricultural service providers, farmers, and nonprofit organizations, among many others, that cared deeply about saving farmland, because farmland isn't just something that farmers can advocate for, but it's also something that is for the greater good or for the public to enjoy. And so this greater coalition came together to support making sure that farmland protection in the state is the farmland protection program in the state is streamlined and fully funded each year. And we'll talk more about some of the mechanisms that Working Lands Alliance has advocated for over the years. And then if you are, and yeah, so you may want to build a coalition depending on what you're advocating for. If you just have like one bill in mind, that's pretty straightforward, and that you think that farmers are, you have enough farmer support behind, you may not need a coalition. But if it's something that you know, impacts a lot of people, you may want to bring together a coalition of stakeholders to help push forward with whatever you're working on. And then lastly, lobbying. And so this is something that does cost some money. You know, on average, a lobbyist can cost anywhere between $16,000 to $20,000 a legislative session, or even more than that for a legislative session, and or if you find a lobbyist that's willing to sign a year contract with you, you know, it can be for a year. And what lobbyists do is they work in the state house, and oftentimes they already have pre-established relationships with people in power, and they can help you navigate the legislative process. They can keep you well informed on what bills you're advocating for, and or other bills that may pop up that will impact the work that you do. Joan knows this all too well. You go into a legislative session thinking, I have all my ducks in a row. These are the bills I'm going to fight for. And then somebody else introduces a bill that you know, may threaten a program that you're advocating for, or kill a program, or take funding away from a program that you know, you're really passionate about making sure remains intact. So lobbyists are there to kind of help you to watch for those things to come up, and to help you navigate those challenges as they arise. And they can also, you know, they're the boots on the ground. So they're in the legislative office building when we are in an in-person session every day, meeting with legislators, meeting with the governor's office, meeting with other key officials to make sure that whatever you're pushing for is moving through the process. Joan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that when it comes to lobbying, there is a whole grocery list of state laws that apply to what lobbyists need to abide by. So you don't just, somebody doesn't just hire you and you become a lobbyist. I believe, Chelsea, if somebody pays you $2,000 or more to advocate specifically on your behalf and you're paid to do that, you're required to register with the state of Connecticut as a lobbyist. And then there's a whole host of filings that's with the on ethics. There's a lot of ethics laws related to lobbying. So it is a regulated industry by the state of Connecticut. I'm a registered lobbyist for Farm Bureau. We also have a paid contract lobbying firm, as does Chelsea's lobbyist, and WLA has a paid lobbying firm. The other interesting thing is that many lobbyists, including the lobbyists that Farm Bureau uses, also lobby for other groups. So when you hire a lobbyist, you also have to be careful, and this is some of the laws that they abide by, that whoever they're lobbying for, they don't there's no conflict of interest between any other group that they may be hired for. So there's a lot of rules and regulations revolving around lobbying, but they play a very important role. And what I like to say is, in the world of agriculture, is the reason that Farm Bureau lobbies and WLA lobbies and other groups is so that while you're at your farm working every day, there's people like us that are up at the Capitol advocating, so to speak, on your behalf, but we're paid to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will just add one quick note on that, is that if you go to the State Board of Ethics website and you're privy to navigating governmental websites, you can actually find a list of all of the registered lobbyists in the state and all of the contract lobbyists, and you can see who they lobby for and what nonprofits and what organizations have lobbyists in the state, which I sometimes do because I find it very interesting. I don't know if you ever do that, Joan, but yeah, it's interesting to know who lobbies for who and who has a lobbyist and who doesn't. So I can put a link in the chat after this if anyone's interested in that. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to go through how does a bill become a law in Connecticut? And this is a slide that highlights the beginning of the process and the end of the process. And now we're going to get into the process. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of steps that a bill has to go through before it becomes a law. The first step is the proposed bill. And this little thumbnail, which you can't see that well, is actually a proposed bill that WLA helped introduce this session. That is a solar siting concept bill that we'll get into more detail on later. But this is legislative language that we, as an organization or as a coalition, put together in hopes that we would see everything in this proposed bill make it into the final legislation. And we worked with Representative Maria Horn to introduce the bill. And so she took our proposed language and maybe made some amendments of her own, and then sent the proposed language to the clerk of the chamber of the sponsoring legislator for numbering. So the sponsoring legislator was Representative Maria Horn, and the chamber gave it a bill number and a bill title number, and if there were sponsors, I believe that there is one sponsor on this bill, one co-sponsor. Well, Representative Maria Horn is our sponsor, and then we have a few co-sponsors. They are printed on the bill, and then the bill is printed in what is called the House and Senate journals. And these are uploaded, now they're uploaded daily to the Connecticut General Assembly website. And you can see daily what new bills are being introduced on these journals. And then simultaneously, the bill is sent to the appropriate joint standing committee of the General Assembly, depending on the subject. Now, because this bill was linked to solar siting on prime farmland, it was sent to the Environment Committee. Next slide, please. Thank you, MC, for putting that in the chat. Okay, so then there are a lot of things that can happen after a bill is sent to committee. So just because you had, just because you had a bill raised doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to pass out of the committee that it was introduced in, or that it's going to be, just because you had a bill introduced doesn't mean that it's going to be raised for a public hearing. So the committee may have the bill drafted in legal language. Oftentimes you'll see bills that have been introduced and they'll just say like an act concerning farmland access, for instance. And then you'll click on it on the Connecticut General Assembly's website and there'll be no legal language, or there'll be like a sentence or two just saying this is an act concerning farmland access in Connecticut. But a committee may say, so a legislator or a few legislators may have a bill raised or introduced, and then the committee may say, okay, well, this concept is good enough that we actually want to make this a committee bill. And so they'll have the bill drafted for other language or legal language. They may combine it with other bills and have it drafted into a committee bill. So for instance, right now in the state legislature, you'll see a lot of different bills moving through or that were introduced that say adding a representative of the agricultural community to the state solar siting council. And there are a few other bills that are related to agriculture or to farmland and solar siting. And so the Environment Committee may decide to have all of those bills condensed into one bill and have a committee bill, which is what I think kind of they are deciding right now. So they may refer the bill to another committee. So there may be a bill that is introduced in environment that's related to farmland protection or farmland access, but it's actually has a huge fiscal note attached to it, or they know it's going to cost a lot of money, so they may refer it to finance, revenue, and bonding. An example of this is that there's been a bill introduced the last 3 sessions that is an act concerning the exemption of agricultural development rights for people that file personal income taxes. If you sell your agricultural development rights that year, you would get an exemption on having to pay sales tax on the sale of the development rights, if that makes sense. And so that bill, because it's a farmland bill, I think originally it may have been introduced to environment, and then it made sense that it actually be moved to finance, revenue, and bonding. And since then, every year it's been introduced in finance, revenue, and bonding. So that's an example. So like I said, just because a bill is introduced, if the committee decides to take no action, the bill fails. Like, it never goes anywhere. It doesn't make it past like getting through the door, I guess would be a good analogy. So, and the committee may also write a new raised committee bill. So there may be bills that were, the committee may decide, okay, well, we actually, this past year identified this issue that we would like to raise a bill concerning that a constituent didn't come to us with that isn't in another raised bill. And so we're going to write this new raised bill. Or they may write a raised bill for an agency. For instance, the Department of Agriculture may go to the Environment Committee and say, can you write a raised bill for us and have these different provisions in it? And so that may be another way that a bill is introduced. So yeah, there's a lot of steps in the process as to how a committee can go about introducing bills. So then once the committee decides that this is a bill that they want to raise, they hold a public hearing on it. And the public hearing is for the public, state agencies, representatives, and legislators on all bills it wishes to consider. So there may be most public hearings, a committee will hear more than one piece of legislation. However, I have seen some public hearings where if there's like a hot topic, they'll just hold a hearing on one bill because they know like tons of people are going to sign up to testify on it. And then at the public hearing, usually the state agencies, representatives, and legislators are given the opportunity to present first, followed by the public. So if you do sign up to testify, you may want to prepare to wait around for a while, depending on what you're testifying on. I have been at public hearings where the state agencies, public officials, representatives, and legislators have gone on for hours, and the public doesn't start testifying until later in the afternoon, and it can take a while because the public officials are not given a time limit, where the public is given a time limit of 3 minutes. Joan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, other than, yeah, I was just going to say, other than we're going to talk later on, Chelsea, on how to testify.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, I think now we would talk about how to testify. So also when you get up to testify, if you do decide to sign up, like I said, you're only given 3 minutes. So you really have to keep it pretty succinct. And it's good to make sure that when you get up there, you state your name, where you live, and the bill you're testifying on. And then because you're all farmers, like legislators want to hear from farmers. So talk about your farm a little bit, and then like why this bill would directly impact your farming business. And how it, like why it matters to you that this passes. And make sure that you stay within that 3-minute timeline or time frame. Sometimes they'll let you go on for a little longer, but it's important that you say things that may make the legislators ask questions, because that will give you more time if they ask you questions to clarify some of the things you said. Joan, do you want to talk more about testifying?
Yeah, and the other thing that's important to do is it's good if you could put something in writing just before the public hearing. It's very easy nowadays to submit written testimony. And if you're going to do that in the written testimony, of course, you want to be concise and succinct at the beginning of your testimony. The most important thing whether it's in written testimony or when you testify, at the very beginning, in addition to introducing yourself, you want to say whether you're supportive or opposing the bill and what the reason is. And the same thing when you submit written testimony, because a lot of times they're also sort of doing a little bit of quick analysis of how many people are supporting the bill and how many people are opposing the bill. So sometimes it's good for them that they can just query through a bunch of written testimony. And if they see a lot of written testimony with overwhelming opposition, that gets their attention. And in your written testimony, you can put in more detail than you would have time to do in your 3 minutes. But again, keep it bulleted, factual, and succinct, because there's a lot of people testifying and there's a lot of information they have to pay attention to.
I have a question. I've always wondered, do legislators actually read all of the testimony that's sent in, or do they just like get a summary? They read it.
They read it, and they also have, all of the legislators have staff. So a lot of times their staff is reading all of this and they're pulling out the highlights and they're tracking. We've had 100 pieces of testimony submitted on this, and 99% of these people are opposing this. So they're also tracking that type of thing.
Yeah, and it's important when you submit testimony to also talk a little bit about your farm and to tell a story, right? Because as farmers, they want to hear your story and why this is so important to you that this bill passes or it fails. And so it's important that you speak to that. And then also when you submit the written testimony to whatever committee you're testifying in, or if you can't show up to testify, you can still submit written testimony. It's important that you CC your legislators on the email so that your legislators know that as a constituent, you care about whatever bill you're testifying for or against. All right, so then after the committee has a public hearing, they may report the bill favorably, meaning that they're going to pass it out of committee. They may defeat the bill or issue not report, meaning the bill fails. I think if they defeat the bill, that also means that they opposed it, which means the bill is not going to be moved out of committee. And so then it goes, so then there's like this time where as an advocate, the bill is kind of, it's like in the building, like when we're physically in the building, I will oftentimes go to the Environment Committee legislative aides and I'll say, where is the bill? Like, what is the status on this current bill that was voted out of committee? And they'll say, oh, it's upstairs. And I'll say, what does that mean? And it means that it has to like go through all these offices before it like comes back down in front of the legislators and you're hearing about it again or like you're actually hearing legislators debate on it again. So the bill requiring action by another committee is referred to that committee. So if there is a fiscal note tied to it, sometimes it will be referred to the Appropriations Committee or the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, or if it touches more than one agency. So for instance, we're not really sure this session how the farm to school bills are going to play out, because they may be referred to a few different agencies before, or a few different committees before they go upstairs to get all the checks and balances done before it heads to the House or the Senate for a vote. So that can happen, and that can kind of hold up the process a little bit. Next slide, please. So after leaving the last committee, the bill is sent to the Legislative Commissioner's office to be checked for constitutionality and consistency with other laws. So this is where they make sure that whatever you're trying to do is legal. They do try to do a little bit of that before it's introduced, but this is where they really make sure that it like lines up with the state constitution. So then it goes to the Office of Fiscal Analysis, and they add any estimate of cost to the bill. So this may be where this can also determine if your bill is going to make it or if it's going to die. It turns out, or I learned that when we were advocating a few years ago for a farmland access task force in the state, I didn't think that a task force would cost the state any money, because it's like a group of volunteers coming together to sit around and create recommendations. But task force actually do cost the state of Connecticut, I think, upwards of $20,000 for all of the administrative costs it takes to convene all those people. So that fiscal note is put on to a bill like a task force bill at this time. So then the Office of Legislative Research adds a plain English explanation to the bill, saying this is what this bill will do if it's passed. And then the clerk assigns the bill a calendar number. And hopefully this will be the year. I found this little calendar thing online. I thought it was cute. All right, next slide, please. So then the bill goes for a vote in the chamber that it was introduced. So if a bill was introduced by a representative, it will have a House bill number. If it was introduced by a senator, it will have a Senate bill number. And if it is a Senate bill, it will go to the Senate first for a vote. And if it is a House bill, it will go to the House first for a vote. So then if it votes out of the chamber that it was introduced in and it gets a yes, the bill is sent to the other chamber for a vote. The other chamber votes on the bill. If they say yes, then there's a final printing of the bill. Next slide, please.
I have just like the most basic question in the world. Is it just like 51% majority it goes through?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I'm pretty sure. I think it depends on what it is. I think there are like probably certain things in the Constitution that you need more than 50%. Like I'm pretty sure when we were going to change the Constitution, so a few years ago, there was a act that went to amend the Constitution that said before land was sold, swapped, or traded by the state, there had to be a public hearing. And to change the Constitution is like a whole nother ball game, because you actually have to have two different legislators vote that they want to have the Constitution changed, and then it has to go on the ballot for a public vote. And I'm pretty sure that when the two different legislators vote that you want to have the Constitution changed, you need like a 2/3 majority. Oh, so it's not just 50%. So I think it depends on what it is.
Got it. Thank you.
Do you know? No. Okay. But yeah, it's a good question. Like I can maybe find out exactly what things you would need more than a 50% or 51% margin. I could ask our lobbyists and get back to you. Okay, so if both chambers pass the bill, it is sent to the governor. So then the governor can sign the bill, he can veto it, or he can take no action. If the governor vetoes the bill, it's returned to the chamber in which it originated. Sometimes there will be some negotiations with the governor and different amendments will be added or taken away depending on what the governor wants. Like he may say, oh, I would sign this if you take out this one thing, or I want, can we add this thing? And if both chambers agree, then the bill can become, then the bill is sent back to the governor and the governor signs off on it, and it becomes a law. So you essentially won. But if the governor fails to sign it within 5 days during the legislative session or 15 days after adjournment, the bill fails. The veto bill is repassed in each house with a 2/3 veto of the elected membership. So if 2/3 of both of the chambers veto it, I think there is a way that it can still become a law without the governor signing off on it, right, Joan? Or is that,
Yep.
Yeah. So that's another way you can win. Any questions?
And I'll just add that one of the reasons that lobbyists are paid the way they're paid, and this, I would say this is for Farm Bureau, is that by the end of the legislative session, we literally could be tracking well over 100 bills. So when we say a bill, we're looking out for the bills that we specifically are sort of champion, like, we reached out to a legislator, we really want to get this done. This is top priority for our members. So we're really closely tracking that. And those are some of the examples Chelsea gave. But because agriculture touches everything, it touches environment, general law, transportation, finance, it touches everything. Children's Committee, I've testified before the Children's Committee. So, it's not unusual that we're not only tracking the bills that we've sort of championed or trying to get passed, but we're also watching all of the other bills that either other groups are introducing or bills that we support. Like WLA will introduce bills and Chelsea will say, well, we hope Farm Bureau can support this one, because that's part of that coalition that she referred to. But we're also watching bills that we think would hurt farmers or hurt agriculture that other people introduce. So not everybody loves thy farmer. So, so we have to be careful that stuff doesn't get passed that does harm to agriculture as well.
Or they want to take money from agriculture.
Right, or they want to raid some of our programs that fund agriculture, the agencies.
Yeah, or another thing that's come up in the past that does impact farmers is there have been a few different legislators now that have wanted to move the Department of Agriculture into the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, which wouldn't give it as much autonomy and may actually hinder some of our programs. And so keeping a standalone Department of Agriculture for the last, I would say, 10 years has definitely been a priority of Working Lands Alliance and Farm Bureaus.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Hamsa because you're probably all tired of hearing me talk. So.
Okay, so basically kind of continuing off of this idea of advocacy and what we're actually fighting for, especially in terms of telling a story, it's become really important to think about this idea of what food justice is. So food justice, depending on who you ask, will have a varied definition. And so I don't have a clear, single definition here because I think it's fair to have those variations. But in general, what it's trying to accomplish is creating an inclusive and equitable space. And those have become really big buzzwords, and it might be tiring to hear them again and again. But basically what it's trying to do is, the idea of food justice is meant to kind of make sure everyone's at the table in a way that makes sense for them, is how I like to think about it. So this could connect to food security, could connect to farmers and producers, a lot of our audience here today. It has a lot to do with cultural appropriateness. A good example of that is, are there maybe resident or other immigrant or other not, Native American in terms of being born in the United States or anything like that, residents in the state of Connecticut who might love local access to produce that they recognize from home that can be grown in Connecticut. What's the potential for something like that? Do people have access to those kinds of foods? Are there farmers who could produce those kinds of foods? Thinking of kind of these, bigger than the status quo kind of questions. And of course, it has a lot to do with racial history, which of course is really important when it comes to land access and land use. So when, maybe you're testifying and you have your 3 minutes and it's already hard to get a lot of information in there, but when you're advocating for policies that might help farmers or anything like that, it's important to ask the questions like I have here that go beyond the immediate issue. So who else might be affected? Who else could be a vested interest in what I'm talking about? And am I missing someone's voice? A lot of times that comes with, for me personally, asking the question of what kind of privilege do I have in this situation? Which there's a lot of people who don't have a lot of privilege, and even getting up to Capitol Hill anywhere can be a huge barrier to a lot of people. And so even thinking like, what does it take in me to get to this point? What might it take for someone else to get to this point? Who else? What other voices might, never get to this point? What voices have always been at this point? Just thinking about these kinds of questions can help us really create a statement or a testimony or a policy that's much more well-rounded, which only when you're talking to legislators who might not have a lot of background on an issue that you're very, very intimately aware of. If you say, I've not just considered this from my point of view, I've considered this from other points of view, and this is my entire understanding of this problem, it adds a lot of credibility to say, I've thought of not only about how this benefits me, but how this advances justice and opportunity for my entire community and how I can feed them. That comes off a lot more powerfully. So it's just an important concept to think about. And there's a lot of resources out there. And at the end, we'll provide our contact information. If you'd like any more of those resources, I can provide them. This is just a basic overview.
Okay, so in addition to the advocacy that we've just been speaking about on the state level, it's very important also for those of us that are advocating for agriculture in Connecticut or are farming, more importantly, farming in Connecticut, that Connecticut, by the nature of our state constitution, which is Article 10 of our state constitution, if you want to ever read Article 10, we are considered what's called a home rule state, which means that in other states in the United States, you have state laws. The state law is sort of the law of the land, and then it all filters down to the municipalities, townships, and then down to sort of the regulated community. In Connecticut, we're considered a bottom-up state. It's a little bit odd. So we have a lot of state laws, but a lot of our state laws are administered locally. So, and primarily that's revolving around our wetlands law, any of our land use laws, planning and zoning laws, and all of our taxation laws are all state laws that are administered locally. So it's very important when you're advocating for agriculture in Connecticut to understand this multiple level process that we have. So we may have, for instance, we have a state right to farm law. It's been in place since 1981. It was passed under Governor O'Neill, protects farmers against the 5 complaints against the 5 nuisances of farming: odor, dust, noise, mild forms of water pollution, and small amounts of pesticide overspray, provided the farmer is doing all of the right things. It says generally accepted agricultural practices. But because we have a right to farm law, doesn't it mean that local zoning doesn't apply to you? And so it's also very important to understand that farming and agriculture can and often is regulated at the local municipal level. So Farm Bureau working with our farmers, as well as the work that Working Lands Alliance and American Farmland Trust has done, for instance, with the Planning for Ag Guide, helps advocates like us working with our farmers to not only make sure we have a good set of laws on the state level and good tax policy on the state level, but we also want to make sure at the local level that planning and zoning regulations and all of the local implementation of tax law is all administered properly at the local level. So in Connecticut, we tend to have sort of this two-layered process. And you can go ahead, Hamsa.
Okay, thanks, Joan. So going off of that, given that local government is so important and influential in how these things can function in the state, we wanted to make sure to highlight some key ways that farmers can actually get involved at the local level to really understand what the issues are, what the current status of some of these regulations and rules might be in the towns and municipalities in Connecticut. So as I mentioned at the top, I'm a board member with Sustainable CT. I used to be a fellow with them, and Sustainable CT is a sustainability credit awarding organization. They're partnered with 118 towns all across the state of Connecticut. And basically they work to advance sustainability-based policies in individual towns throughout the state. So what's been really neat is they recently went through a huge reworking of a lot of actions that towns can take. And there are multiple agricultural friendly actions that local residents can really get involved with and advocate for in their towns. So I have a couple of them here. One is for towns to promote land use policies that support agriculture. So if there's been something in your town that's been a struggle or anything like that, it's a great opportunity, especially if your town is registered with Sustainable CT, to be like, hey, this land use policy that planning and zoning might be working on really makes this part of farming difficult for me. So can we do something that supports agriculture a little bit more? The great thing about local government is oftentimes if you go to your town's website, there's a planning and zoning little button that you can click and there will be a list of people there. You might find emails, you might find phone numbers, and worst comes to worst, you will find just the phone number for a certain department. You can call it. More often than not, someone will pick up and they will actually be able to answer what you need answered, which is something I personally love about local government. It's a really answerable. There's usually most of the time someone on the other end of the line, or there's an answering machine that will be listened to. And if you need to, you can always take a relatively shorter drive than maybe going all the way to Hartford to get someone to listen to your issues. So it's a great way to have your voice heard. Another one of the newer policies that is being promoted is agricultural use of municipal land. So this is actually being done in a couple of towns in Connecticut where there's really old municipal land that wasn't used by any residents. It wasn't sold. It was just under the, property of the town. And they've basically leased that land out to young farmers who are now tending to and maintaining that land and able to make a living off of it. So it's actually happening in the state of Connecticut, and it is an opportunity that towns can earn credit for. So if you ask about those opportunities, there is a benefit for the town as well if they get involved. And the last one I think is really the greatest opportunity, which is holding a farmer forum to identify agriculture issues is something that towns are given credit for. So if you can go to a board of selectmen, a board of aldermen, if you're in a town small enough, you can even go directly to the mayor or the first selectman in the town and say, hi, I'm a farmer, I work and I live in this town. I really would appreciate if we could have a forum, maybe with some of the elected board members and you and maybe someone from planning and zoning, just to talk about some of the issues that we face. That's something that really you can ask for. It's not something that would be out of the blue or weird to ask for. It's absolutely something that a resident in Connecticut can do. And they're all great ways for especially young farmers, but farmers of any age for that matter, to get involved and to really get to meet people. Like I said, these are people who live in and represent that town. They are there more often than not to support that community. They are excited to represent the people that they live with and to work with their neighbors from my experience, and it's a great way to get involved. There are two websites right there. The first is just the straight Sustainable CT website. If you go there, you can get an entire map of the entire state, and it'll show you all the towns that are registered, so you can find out if there's ways to get involved. If your town's not involved, you can go ask someone to get registered. It's free and it's easy, and that usually gets towns interested. And the second link there is to the specific agriculture-friendly policies that towns can get involved in. So, as Joan mentioned, local government really can be quite influential, and we're lucky enough in the state to have an organization that has concrete ways for towns to get credit, to get benefits for engaging young farmers. So very exciting. And with that, I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Hamsa. That was great. All right, so now Joan and I thought it might be good to just go over some of the various funding mechanisms for how Connecticut pays for the state and local agricultural programs that are available to farmers. And one of the most important funding mechanisms is the Community Investment Act. And so for those of you that are not familiar with the Community Investment Act, it is a $40 buyer's conveyance fee that is on every single real estate transaction in the state. So every time you go to buy a house, you are charged this $40 fee that is then divided through a formula between the town clerk and the affordable housing, open space preservation, farmland preservation, dairy sustainability, and historic preservation sectors. And so I'm actually, as somebody that advocates for farmland preservation, I sit on the Community Investment Act Coalition, as does Joan, because she advocates on behalf of dairy farmers throughout the state. And every year we meet and are actively making sure that the Community Investment Act remains its own standalone account, so that these great programs continue to support the various sectors that they are aimed at supporting. And I also just want to mention that the Community Investment Act, while it says that, while I just explained that it does support farmland preservation, it also supports other programs at the Connecticut Department of Agriculture. So the Ag Viability Grant Program, the Farm Transition Grant Program, the Connecticut Food Policy Council, the Connecticut Wine Development Council, all of those are funded through the Community Investment Act. So it's not just funding that goes towards farmland preservation and the dairy sustainability account. It also goes towards a lot of the programs that you as young and beginning farmers, or as farmers in the state, may apply for grants to help with your agricultural needs. So then the other ways that agriculture and farmland protection are funded in the state are through bonding. So bonds create a debt to the state, and principal and interest is usually repaid over a 20-year period. Lump sum bonding is when the state gives like one large bond for something. So in the case of farmland preservation, sometimes we'll get one large lump sum bond of $10 million for us to use on farmland protection efforts. In the past, before we were authorized to do lump sum bonding, every time there was a farmland preservation project that came up, we had to go to the bond commission and argue why the bond commission needed to give bond funds for that specific project. And so this way, by having lump sum bonding in place, it makes it so that the process is a lot easier for farmers to navigate, and the funding is at the discretion of the Department of Agriculture and not at the discretion of the bond commission. And so having lump sum bonding has definitely been a benefit to the farmland preservation program. There's also the general funds. This is the allocation of state net revenues. This is usually what pays for the agency budget. So Governor Lamont released his biannual budget. When did he release it, Joan? I think it was 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
And he outlined how he was going to allocate general funds for the next 2 years to various state agencies. There's also the Green Bank, and the reason why I included this, a quasi-public agency, the Green Bank is funded through a combination of funds from the private sector and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, is because in Governor Lamont's 2021 legislative proposals, he is recommending that the Green Bank be expanded to include a environmental infrastructure fund, and the environmental infrastructure fund could be used on carbon sequestration efforts that are linked to conservation or agriculture or other various provisions that he outlined in his legislation. And he is recommending that the statute be amended so that the Green Bank will be able to receive federal funds if the Biden administration passes legislation that will support states in implementing more climate change, or that will allow states to have federal funds that they can allocate towards climate change adaptation and resiliency efforts, I guess is a good way to put it. And so the Green Bank may potentially become a funding mechanism that will help with some of the agricultural programs that we would like to see the state implement to help farmers adapt and become more resilient in the face of climate change. There's also local funding. Some local towns have set aside funds for farmland protection and open space conservation. Hamsa, you mentioned that Sustainable CT gives credit if farmers convene discussions around planning. And I also wanted to mention that there are ag commissions throughout the state. And so I don't know, Joan, if you want to talk a little bit more about ag commissions and what they might do in terms of advocating for local regulations and maybe even some local funding if the opportunity arises.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about that now, or do you want to finish your funding?
I guess I can just finish the funding. There's also federal funding. So USDA NRCS has a lot of federal funding for farmers. In recent years, Working Lands Alliance has been working closely with USDA NRCS to make sure that all the state's agricultural conservation easement program, agricultural land easement funds are spent down. So the state each year receives between $3 to $5 million in federal funding to do farmland preservation projects. And the federal funding needs to be matched at 50% by state, local, or private funds. And so we work with both the Department of Agriculture and USDA NRCS to make sure that both entities are using their matching funds and leveraging one another so that we can spend down all of that federal funding and protect lots of farms.
Yeah, and Chelsea, can I just weigh in on the federal funding? A vast majority of the federal funding that filters down not only for federal programs for agriculture, but state programs is funded through the big farm bill. So every 5 years or so, you'll hear a lot on the news about Congress passing yet another farm bill. I think it comes up every 5 years, and there's been some farm bills that have been very contentious, and it's taken them like a year and a half to fund the farm bill. But the important thing to understand about the farm bill is that historically people associated that with programs for agriculture in the big commodity states in the Midwest. But in reality, all of your school nutrition programs, a lot of your social food and nutrition programs that all the states benefit from, and then almost all of the USDA programs, regardless of what state you're in, is all funded through the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is something that, when we talk about national advocacy, is something that we watch very closely because it touches all of us, regardless of how big or small a state you're in.
And I have something to say on the Farm Bill, but I'm going to save it for the end when we talk about federal policy. Joan, did you also want to talk about ag commissions really quickly?
I'll just make this real quick. So a number of years ago, there was a program, it's still in place, called the Advocate Program. And it started out in Eastern Connecticut. It was funded through some grant work, and it was initiatives to have towns start to form ag commissions Ag commissions are advisory in nature, they're not regulatory, but it's a really good way for each town to have a group of peers that are in town looking out for the benefits of and the interests of agriculture. I think there's around over 30 ag commissions in the state. Then a number of years ago, Connecticut Farm Bureau helped pass a law that now provides enabling legislation for regional ag councils. And the first one was passed, was introduced and put into place about 6 years ago, which is the Lower Connecticut River Valley Regional Ag Council. And so it overlaps the regional planning aid, the geography of the regional planning agency, RiverCog in the Lower Connecticut River Valley. But what it does is every town within that regional planning authority sends a representative to the Ag Council. And those towns that already have ag commissions, it doesn't negate the use of those local ag commissions. Those ag commissions just send a representative to the council. But it's a really good way to get a regional approach to planning for agriculture in a particular area, because if you look at the towns and the size of Connecticut, I call them the little 169 little fiefdoms. You know, most fiefdoms are not that different than the fiefdom, 5 miles down the road. And more often than not, the interests related to agriculture are very, very common. And I think as we also start to talk about the urban agriculture, which is very, very important, I think it's also good if you're in areas that have urban centers to be able to provide a more holistic approach to what you're doing for agriculture in that region. So you have the interface between urban ag and the more rural communities, but within a certain area. So I'm a big proponent of regional ag councils.
I am too. And Anne, I know you sit on don't you sit on your ag commission? No, you don't.
No, I used to. I'm not on it now, but I wonder about how do you form a regional one then? Because like our local one sometimes isn't as active as I would like.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits. I mean, we can talk, maybe I think we should get through our presentation. I can answer that, how you adopt an ag commission at the end if we have time. But that's one of the benefits of having an ag council. I think RiverCog represents 18 towns, 18 or 19 towns in the lower River Valley, and you send one representative versus 18 towns that have to have their own individual commission times 5 to 7 people. You're trying to engage a significant number of people to help agriculture in that town, versus if you do a more collaborative effort. I think a lot of times you can get just as much work done without having to seat full commissions in each town. So we can talk about that at the end, Anne, if there's time.
Okay, great. Next slide, please, Hamsa. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. Here are some exciting bills that are happening this session that you may want to pay attention to. So this first one is actually related to creating more local funding for farmland protection and conservation, or open space conservation and stewardship. So this bill, House Bill 5100, which is its own standalone legislation, but the governor also introduced it in his legislative proposals. So this bill probably won't go anywhere because it was one of those instances where it was combined with a much larger package, and the governor's bill is more likely to be raised for a hearing. But this piece of legislation would allow towns to voluntarily implement up to 2% conveyance fee tax, much like the Community Investment Act, that the local municipality could then use to protect farms, on open space conservation, on stewardship. So they may decide to use it on helping farmers transition to more regenerative ag practices. There's like a whole list of things that are outlined in the governor's proposal as to what this conveyance fee could be used on. and it would be voluntary. So it would be up to the municipality to implement it. Right now, as the state statute is written, municipalities can't put this voluntary tax into place, but many other states have allowed their municipalities to do this, including Massachusetts, and it has led to doing a lot more farmland protection and open space conservation projects. The next bill is an act exempting from the personal income tax proceeds from the sale of agricultural land development rights. This act I kind of went over earlier. This is if you went to sell your development rights, you would not have to pay personal income tax on the sale of your development rights. The next one is an act concerning the responsibilities of the State Properties Review Board concerning the purchase of agricultural development rights. So right now, the State Properties Review Board is slowing down the purchase of development rights process. And so Working Lands Alliance has worked with Representative Gresco and Senator Austin to introduce legislation that would help clarify the role of the State Properties Review Board so that we can make sure that they are doing their job and protecting farms at a appropriate pace. And then the next bill, which I think would be really interesting for this group to know about, is Senate Bill 471. This is an act concerning funding for the purchase of agricultural real estate by the state. What this bill does is it increases the amount that the Connecticut Department of Agriculture can expend on buy, protect, sell projects. And what buy, protect, sell is it's where the agency buys land at its full real estate value or its fee simple value, protects it with an agricultural conservation easement, and then sells the land at its discounted price to a nonprofit organization or municipality who can then go and sell it to a farmer. And so right now, the state can only spend up to $2 million annually on these projects. And we are trying to increase that amount to $5 million because as we've seen with the pandemic, the price of real estate continues to go up. And there are a lot of farms now that are pretty expensive. And not only that, but we want to make sure that the agency is able to do more than just 1 to 2 of these buy, protect, sell projects each year, because we do see it as a way that we can start to protect more farms and keep more farms in agriculture. Next slide, please. Okay, so then there are a lot of environment and agriculture provisions moving through the legislature. There's HB or House Bill 5175, an act concerning the siting of solar facilities on certain farmland. This is a bill that Working Lands Alliance worked with Representative Maria Horn to introduce. And as we look at the future of the agricultural sector and what our farmlands are being used for, it's hard to not see a lot of our farmland being targeted for solar development. And while the state does have aggressive alternative energy goals that we should strive to meet, we should make sure that we're not meeting those goals at the cost of losing our agricultural lands for food production. And so we introduced this piece of legislation to put some regulations around what solar developers are able to do on our lands, or on our working lands. So basically what this legislation does is it does a lot of things. If a solar developer does go through the Solar Siting Council and is approved to put a huge solar array on prime and important farmland, they have to pay into a mitigation fund that will help protect farmland somewhere else. So it's a mitigation fund to make sure that they are still protecting some of our agricultural land. It requires that solar developers pay for the decommissioning of the solar arrays. So if in 20 years this technology becomes obsolete, we don't want the price tag of removing the solar arrays to fall onto the farmer. And so we're requiring that the solar developer pay upfront for the removal of the arrays once they are no longer able to be used. It also requires that somebody from the agricultural community sit on the State Solar Siting Council. so that while some of these larger projects are going through review, there's somebody with agricultural expertise that can say whether or not if a developer is proposing to do like a dual use project where they want to have livestock underneath the arrays, or they want to have a bee pollinator habitat, having somebody with agricultural expertise on the Solar Siting Council to say whether or not that is feasible, and the developer has thought through what everything that is needed to make that happen, we think would be valuable to the agricultural sector, because there has been some projects that have gone through where they haven't been completely vetted out to make sure that all the things are in place for agriculture and the solar to coexist successfully together, would be a good way of putting it. And then lastly, it would also make it so that the Solar Siting Council has to be transparent when it is reviewing projects that touch farmland. So right now, if you go to the Solar Siting Council's website, you can see the projects that they're reviewing, but it's really hard to navigate, and we're just arguing that there should be more transparency in the process. So then there is another act that I wanted to put on here, is an act removing the property tax exemption from solar projects and reclassifying the tax calculation of solar projects on one parcel of land. This was also introduced by Senator Austin. I haven't seen the details for this yet, but I wanted to put this on here as another legislation that may be combined with the legislation that Working Lands Alliance proposed, that I also will just mention. We are pretty confident it will be increased, or it will be changed to also include core forest in addition to our farmlands. And then there is another bill that we're hopeful will be raised, Senate Bill 467, an act concerning soil health. Actually, I think this was raised. We're hopeful it will go somewhere. This would just clarify in statute that the soil and water conservation districts are charged with also looking at soil health practices. So they're already doing it. We're just clarifying their role in statute. And then I already kind of went over the Governor Lamont's Act concerning climate change adaptation. That's the one that includes the green bank and the open space conveyance fee, among other provisions, and I encourage you to read it. Next slide. So then we have agricultural provisions. So there's House Bill 5379, an act promoting the participation in vocational agricultural work programs by small farms. Joan, do you want to talk about this bill? I did read it, but I was like, maybe Joan is involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just very briefly, conceptually, I think it was raised by Representative Harrison. Conceptually, it's a really good idea. It's a way to try to get small farms to be able to hire vocational ag students. So the vocational ag students get experience on farms, paid position. It helps to relieve some of the pressure of hiring seasonal employees, youth on small farms, but there's some nuances in the law that are a little bit clunky. So I think it's a good concept, but it needs a little work.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I just saw it and thought it said that it impacted small farms. So I thought it might be of interest to this group.
Yeah, what it's trying to do, the long and the short of it is, after a lot of research on it, it looks like what the proponent is trying to do is get the state of Connecticut to pick up the tab on workers' comp policies for ag students to work on small farms, and the reality of the state of Connecticut ever paying workers' comp policy insurance is like slim to none. So I think there may be another way to get this accomplished, but otherwise it would have a fiscal note. The state generally is not buying workers' comp policy for anybody.
Okay, good to know. All right, so then we have House Bill 5767, an act concerning farm to school programs. So there were a lot of farm to school pieces of legislation that were introduced this year. This bill, HB 5767, was actually raised in partnership, or it was raised by with the support of the Connecticut Farm to School Collaborative. And what this bill would do is it would create a $500,000 grant program for school districts to pay or to get compensated if they were to create and implement a farm to school program. There are a lot of different things that are outlined in the bill. I was a part of a coalition that helped craft it, but it is 5:30 and unfortunately I don't remember all of them, but I can share the bill with everyone in this group here in a minute or two. And then there are two agency bills that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. There's HB 6385, an act concerning enhancement to certain agricultural programs. This clarifies what the Connecticut Grown name means and also allows for the state's senior farmers market nutritional program to be used on chicken eggs. So not all poultry, just chicken eggs. Among many other things that may help the agricultural sector, and just clarifies some of the statutes at the Department of Agriculture. And then there's Senate Bill 840, which is also an agency bill, an act concerning Connecticut's Shellfish Restoration Program and Connecticut Seafood Council. Joan, do you know much about this bill?
Yeah, I think it's for the agency to purchase some sort of infrastructure of vessels to help with the continued restoration of the shellfish beds. For those of you that are not aware of it, there's about 60,000 acres of shellfish beds under Long Island Sound. The largest farms in Connecticut are under Long Island Sound. So this is a way to help enhance the restoration of those shellfish beds, and I think it also reconfigures, Chelsea, the individuals or the appointments to the Connecticut Seafood Council.
Yes, which is hopefully something that we can do for every council at some point, is clarify, is reconfigure who sits on the various boards and commissions that the agency convenes, because some of those statutes are extremely out of date in terms of the appointments that they make. Joan and I have talked about this before, so at some point.
Subject near and dear to our heart.
Yeah. Anyways, next slide, please. Okay, so in my new role as the New England policy manager for American Farmland Trust, I've started to look at policies outside of Connecticut, and I thought that this chart might be interesting. Maybe instead of like going through the whole chart, I can just share it with you all afterwards, and I can just go through one of the line items that I thought might be of interest. So as states look towards as state legislatures look towards how they can increase diversity and promote food justice in the agricultural sector, a lot of state legislatures and state agencies have started to convene working groups or introduce legislation that will increase diversity in the agricultural sector. So in Connecticut, the Connecticut Department of Agriculture is going to make an announcement on the 23rd, which is on, what day is that? That's on Tuesday, about a diversity, equity, and inclusion group that they plan to convene in the Department of Agriculture. And so I encourage you, if you're not already, sign up for their mailing list. The Connecticut Department of Agriculture sends out a weekly ag bulletin, and oftentimes they'll make those announcements in the ag bulletin. This announcement they didn't send out in the ag bulletin, but I was told by people in the agency that's when they're going to make it. So I'm going to hold them to that unless I hear otherwise. So apparently there'll be a press conference on Tuesday about their efforts. In Massachusetts, there's legislation being introduced to create a equity in agriculture working group that will bring together members of the agricultural sector in Massachusetts to discuss how to increase the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are farming in the state, among other things that the group has been charged with. In New Hampshire, there's actually legislation that will make it illegal for state agencies to have diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings and schools. And so they're like, I talked to some advocates in New Hampshire, and they're trying to fight that legislation. And so the current legislature is not moving forward on introducing anything to necessarily promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then in Vermont, there is H273, an act relation to promoting racial and social equity in land access and property ownership. And what this act would do, it's actually, this is the legislative title for this act, but the group of advocates that's working on it is calling it the Vermont Bipac-Led Land Access Opportunity Act. And what this act would do is it would create a $10 million fund that BIPOC producers and homeowners could apply to for down payment assistance and mortgage assistance. There will be a BIPOC-led board that will oversee how the funds are allocated to BIPOC homeowners and BIPOC landowners in the state. And then Rhode Island is looking at implementing something very similar to Massachusetts, an act promoting equity in agriculture. Both of these states are looking at replicating what California did in 2017. They passed a Equity in Agriculture Act that their State Department of Agriculture then convened a race and ag working group that that drafted a report to look at how to increase diversity in agriculture in the state. And then in Maine, there's nothing specific, but there is legislation being introduced to make all of their state agencies look at how they can better reach out to diverse communities in terms of promoting and having underserved or socially disadvantaged groups utilize the various programs that state agencies offer in Maine. So that's just like one example of how throughout the New England region, oftentimes we are moving forward on similar things. And I just want to put a plug here that, in my new role as New England policy manager, one thing I'm starting to think through is how we as a region can influence the Farm Bill, because I think, Joan, to your point, we're such small potatoes in Connecticut, but if we, like, compared to states like California, but if we as a region, like if we worked with all the other New England states and all of the other ag producers and agricultural sector in the New England states to like collectively come up with stuff that we wanted our congressional delegation to advocate for, I think we could have much more impact on how much Farm Bill funding and the types of programs that are in the Farm Bill if we worked closely as a region, if that makes sense. So that's something I've been thinking about. But I can share this chart with you, and there's actually another one after this. Hamsa, if you want to go to the next slide. I can share this one and this one with you after this presentation, if that would be of use to everyone, if you would want to see them. Okay, and so then at the federal level, I already talked about my spiel with American Farmland Trust and what I want to do, and these are some other organizations that are doing federal policy work, so I'll turn it over to Joan.
Did you want me to take this?
Yeah, did you want to talk about what American Farm Bureau Federation is doing?
Yeah, so I'll just give you a sort of a quick rundown on how Farm Bureau advocates in general. We are considered a grassroots organization. So we are very much a bottom-up organization. So American Farm Bureau Federation in Washington does not sort of dictate what the states are going to advocate for on the state level, nor do they tell us what they're going to advocate for on the federal level. we are a grassroots organization, which means that our farmers in each individual state come to us and say, these are important for my farm. These are important policies that I think Farm Bureau should work on. The farmers come to us at the state level. There's 51 Farm Bureaus in the United States. There's one in Puerto Rico. Collectively represents about 6 million farmers and ranchers across the United States. And then all of us sort of operate under American Farm Bureau Federation down in Washington, D.C., which collectively lobbies for on the federal level, but it all starts with the farmers. So for an example, under the new administration, Farm Bureau has been fighting for years for comprehensive immigration reform, and we also need a much better guest worker program. The H-2A program that we have right now is very cumbersome for employees. All of agriculture, including in Connecticut, relies a lot on our migrant and seasonal workers, and we desperately need regulation that's going to make it safe and legal for all of these important workers to be able to come and go from the United States to back to their families and their homelands. And the system we have right now has been broken for years, as many of you know if you watch the news and what's been going on with immigration reform. And what's happened is Washington has been reluctant to carve out what agriculture needs versus overlying all immigration to the United States, and therefore getting a good guest worker program to replace the current H-2A program hasn't happened because everybody wants to do immigration all under one big umbrella. But the needs of agriculture is different than all of the other social issues which need to be fixed for immigration. So that's just one small but important piece of legislation that we've been working on for seems like forever. And then dairy policy is another big thing because dairy farmers are paid based on federal milk pricing, and our farmers in the Northeast are at an economic disadvantage because their input costs are higher than they are in the rest of the country. And that's why our dairy farmers, it's so hard for them to stay sustainable because they're stuck with the federal milk pricing system. So we're constantly looking to try and fix that as well for the benefit of our farmers. And there's a lot more, but time's running out.
Yeah, I can just hop in and talk a little bit about the National Young Farmers Coalition. So the new Connecticut Farmer Alliance is a member of the National Young Farmers Coalition. It is a group of about 200,000 farmers from across the nation, many of whom are not such young farmers anymore and have been farming for quite a long time. And they actually just released their policy platform, which I will put into the chat in case you want to follow along while I'm talking about it. So their policy platform consists of 5 pillars, and the basis of all the pillars is racial equity. So trying to support programs that will support Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color, and understanding that each of the pillars has racial justice implications. And as we sort of implement solutions for each of these pillars, racial justice and support for BIPOC farmers has to really be front and central. So the pillars are, and I'm sure that as farmers in the room, you can just immediately recognize how important each of these are. Climate action, land access and tenure, access and accountability to federal programs, labor and immigration, a lot of what Joan just said is relevant here, and student debt relief. So after a lot of surveying of members and a really long policy setting platform, these were the 5 issues that came up as the most important. And some of these issues, the National Young Farmers Coalition is going to work on directly. I think climate action, land access and tenure, and access and accountability to federal programs are really things that the coalition is taking on the federal level. And then labor and immigration and student debt relief, I think they're planning to play a little bit more of that coalitional role, understanding that these things have a huge impact on young farmers, that maybe National Young Farmers Coalition isn't the people to write that legislation, but are there to support and advocate for other folks' legislation. If you want to stay updated on the policy work that the coalition does, you can check it out at the link I'm just throwing into the chat. And I would, as always, just if you're not already a member, definitely plug being a member. Not only do you get discounts at like Johnny's Seeds and I don't know, you could buy a BCS at a discount and all these other things, but it's also a really wonderful way to sort of keep in touch with other farmers who see farming as justice work and as sort of a way to heal these broader social problems. And I think that's really apparent in some of their policy setting decisions.
Great. And I will just add, American Farmland Trust also does advocacy work at the federal level. Most of our work focuses on farmland protection, farmland access, and climate and ag policy. We try to remain true to our mission of land that is centered around land. But like National Young Farmers Coalition, we will support other policies that keep farmers on the land as we see fit. And then there are a few other groups that I want to just highlight. Well, maybe before I highlight them, American Farmland Trust does send out monthly newsletters, and we do sometimes have blogs that we release on our on how we are showing up and what federal policies we are supporting or working on introducing. You can oftentimes find out about them on our Facebook page, or we do also have a membership and we send them out in our monthly newsletters. There are 3 other organizations on here. National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition brings together a lot of the grassroots organizations that are on the ground and don't have the capacity to do lobbying at the federal level. And they're a great network to follow. They send around, I think, pretty frequent federal policy updates. It's not just about, they don't just send around updates around legislation that's being introduced. Sometimes they'll send around updates around the need for programs that they advocated for to be spent down. So, you know, like right now, I think they were trying to do some work around making sure that states were spending down all their EQIP funding. So they'll send around something around that. There's also the NASDA group, which is not really open to the public, but is an interesting group. It's the National it's the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. So Commissioner Hurlburt is a part of this group, and what this group does is it brings together all of the ag commissioners from around the country, and they all like sign on to different policy platforms and hear from one another about what's happening in different states. And oftentimes they'll sign on to resolutions, and they have this whole policy manual. And it's interesting to follow if you want to know what you know, our commissioner is agreeing to do as part of the NASDA Association, and it's how Commissioner Hurlburt does his federal lobbying. So I encourage you to check it out at some point. They have a policy manual and everything as well. And then there's also the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group that does some policy work as well. They're a little bit less active and try to do most of their work through National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, but they do convene some grassroots organizations that don't have the resources to attend the NASDA conferences and hold these commissioners accountable. And so they are doing some grassroots work around that. And if you are interested in that group, you can email me and I can tell you how to get involved. Next slide, please.
Oh, I was just going to chime in quickly to mention that NSAC, or the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, one other resource they have that I really appreciate is they have a pretty comprehensive blog that they publish articles on very regularly. And it does a great job of kind of translating the legalese of kind of the language of bills and changes happening in the Farm Bill, particularly in the 2018 Farm Bill. There were some changes that their staff goes through and does all the research and kind of translates the major changes in a really readable and easy way. So if that's a resource that's of interest, they also do provide that as well. And I'll go to the next slide.
So just a quick blurb on Connecticut Farm Bureau. So we are a nonprofit grassroots. We just celebrated 101 years in the state of Connecticut. We have just over 2,500 farm families in the state of Connecticut. We represent all of agriculture, so everything from the aquaculture industry to forest products to the greenhouse industry to livestock, small farmers, large farms. We represent everybody. Our members are a cross section of all of agriculture. Because we're a membership servicing organization, we do charge dues to membership. And with those dues comes one-on-one support to our farmer members. So if you're a member, you pay dues to Connecticut Farm Bureau, you get my undivided attention for any sort of direct assistance you need for your farm. And we also, as we had mentioned earlier, we advocate both on the federal, state, and local level. And we have a website. You can join through our website. It's a secured website, or you can call our office. Our office is located in a commercial piece of real estate that we own in Wethersfield, which also houses Chelsea's office and her dog.
Yes. Next slide, please. Yeah, and like I said, I do all of my work in Connecticut for the Working Lands Alliance. I am the director of Working Lands Alliance. And if you want to stay involved in our coalition, I'm not really as great about sending out emails as some of the other groups that are mentioned on this call. I'll be pretty honest about that. But AFT is hiring a new communications director to help me with some of this stuff. So I'm really excited. Hopefully I'll have more capacity to send out more frequent emails. But you can sign up for a listserv to stay involved, or you can email me. I am hoping that with this new communications person we're hiring, we can figure out a way to do more regional policy tracking work, like what I did with that chart that I created for this group, so that on our website we'll have a New England policy page, and you can go to that and see some of the other states and what they're doing in terms of policies that might be relevant to AFT's mission. So we're not going to track all ag policies. They're going to have to be directly linked to what AFT, to our mission. But if you want to learn, and I'm trying to figure out how to do this right now. So if you want to be informed as to when that rolls out and what that looks like, you can send me an email, and I'm like creating a spreadsheet right now of all the people that are interested in that. So last slide, we're almost done. There's also Connecticut Food System Alliance, which MC put the link in the chat, and they do weekly bill tracking updates. So if you want to follow what they're doing, they pretty much track every single ag and food system policy that's out there, and send around updates on the various pieces of legislation that are moving through the State House. You can also track bills on the Connecticut General Assembly website, and it's pretty easy to figure out, but this is also a good way to stay informed if you don't have time for that. And that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
This is always really fun for me to do, and I appreciate you all taking time to be a part of this, because this is like what we do day in and day out. So we might get a little nerdy about it. So sorry if anything was level over 101. Any questions? Hamsa or Joan, do you have any last thoughts?
No, I would just say, if you're at all interested in more information on how to get engaged in and advocate for farming in your community, I put my contact information in the chat. I know I've worked with Ann. Ann, I'm going to call you out, but I've worked with Ann over the years with her farm. So if, we also, if you're a member of Farm Bureau, we offer letters of support, help you with grant programs and that type of thing. So, if you have any questions unique to your farm or what's going on in your community, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you, Mary Claire, for inviting me and including us. I thought this was great. And thanks, Chelsea and Hamsa, for your coordination on this. It was awesome.
My pleasure. And I will send out the recording, and if it's okay with all the presenters, link to your slideshow to everyone who attended, and those who signed up but weren't able to attend, just so that we can all access those links and refresh ourselves on all of the great information that was shared today.
Great. Hamsa, because you have the final slideshow, can you share it? Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll send it over to MC, and then that might be the easiest way to disseminate to whoever would have the most use with it.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much to our presenters and to everyone for coming.